War doesn't begin with gunfire. It begins in boardrooms where contracts are signed, in factories where production lines never stop, in ledgers where destruction becomes just another column of revenue. While European cities collapsed into rubble and millions were pushed toward starvation, an invisible system continued operating with almost mechanical efficiency, transforming chaos into productivity, suffering into steady capital flow. The Second World War didn't paralyze the global economy, it reorganized it. You are on War Profits, where we uncover how war became business. There's a peculiar silence that follows certain kinds of profit. Not the silence of shame, but something colder. The silence of systems that outlive their scandals, of mechanisms so embedded in the economic order that questioning them feels almost naive. When we think of war profiteering,
we imagine shadowy arms dealers or corrupt officials skimming off military budgets. We rarely think about the ordinary machinery of industrial capitalism simply doing what it was designed to do: produce, expand, maximize efficiency, generate returns. We don't think about how the same assembly line that revolutionized peacetime manufacturing could, with minimal adjustment, become the backbone of mechanized warfare. We don't ask what happens when a company built on efficiency encounters a conflict that demands production at any cost. By the late 1930s, the world stood on the edge of industrial war, a kind of conflict that would be won not just by soldiers, but by factories, by the capacity to turn raw materials into tanks, trucks, aircraft, engines faster than the enemy could destroy them. This was war as logistical problem, war as production challenge. And in that environment, certain companies possessed something more valuable than weapons. They possessed systems. Systems for mass production, systems for coordinating supply chains across continents, systems for training workers, standardizing parts, reducing costs, eliminating waste. These systems had been perfected during peacetime, celebrated as the future of modern industry. Now they would be tested under conditions their designers never publicly acknowledged. Ford Motor Company entered the 1940s as more than an automobile manufacturer. It was an empire of industrial knowledge, a template for how modern production should function. Henry Ford's assembly line had fundamentally altered manufacturing worldwide, proving that complex products could be built faster, cheaper, more uniformly than anyone had imagined. By the time war arrived, Ford operated not just in America, but across Europe, factories in Germany, Britain, France. Each one a node in a transnational production network. The company had spent decades exporting not just cars, but an entire philosophy of industrial organization: efficiency, standardization, vertical integration, control over every stage of production, from raw material to finished product. When Germany began rearming in the mid-30s, it needed exactly what Ford had perfected: the ability to produce vehicles at scale, with precision, under pressure. The German subsidiary, Ford Werke in Cologne, had been operating since 1925, initially producing civilian vehicles for the European market. But as the Nazi regime accelerated militarization, the line between civilian and military production began to blur. Trucks that could carry goods could also carry troops. Engines designed for commercial transport could power military logistics. The factory didn't need to transform, it simply needed to redirect its existing capacity toward a different customer.
And redirected it did. By 1938, Ford Werke had begun producing trucks for the Wehrmacht. These weren't tanks or bombers. They were the unglamorous backbone of military operations, the vehicles that moved supplies, ammunition, personnel across expanding fronts. The 3-ton truck became Ford Werke's signature military product, eventually accounting for the majority of its wartime output. Production numbers climbed steadily, thousands of vehicles rolling off assembly lines in Cologne, each one feeding the logistical apparatus that allowed German forces to sustain operations across multiple theaters. The factory operated with the same principles Ford had championed in Detroit: maximize throughput, minimize waste, Standardize components. Train workers to perform repetitive tasks with machine-like consistency. But there was a problem. War consumes labor faster than economies can supply it voluntarily.
As German men were conscripted into military service, factories faced severe labor shortages. The regime's solution was systematic: forced labor, prisoners of war, civilians from occupied territories, concentration camp inmates, people who had no choice, no wages worth the name, no ability to refuse. By 1943, Ford Werke employed thousands of forced laborers. Estimates suggest around half the workforce consisted of people working under coercion. They came from France, Belgium, the Soviet Union, Poland. They worked 12-hour shifts, building the trucks that would supply the armies occupying their homelands. They slept in barracks. They received minimal food. Some died from exhaustion, malnutrition, industrial accidents that were never properly investigated. The factory kept producing. Here's where the mechanism reveals itself most clearly. Ford Werke was technically a German subsidiary, legally distinct from the American parent company. During the war, communication between Detroit and Cologne was officially severed due to conflict between the United States and Germany. This separation created a convenient ambiguity. Who was responsible for decisions made in a foreign subsidiary during wartime? The German managers running Ford Werke claimed they were following orders from the Nazi regime, operating under conditions of state control. The American executives in Detroit claimed they had lost operational authority once the war began, that the subsidiary was effectively nationalized. Both sides pointed to the other. The legal structure, designed in peacetime to optimize tax efficiency and limit liability, now served a different function. It diffused accountability. But the separation was never as clean as it appeared. Before America entered the war, Ford's American operations continued supplying the Allies, while the German subsidiary supplied the Wehrmacht. The company was, in effect, arming both sides, not through conspiracy, but through the ordinary functioning of a multinational corporation during a global conflict. Each subsidiary pursued its own contracts, its own production targets, its own profits. The system didn't require coordination. It required only that each unit maximize efficiency within its respective market. War had become that market. The financial results were extraordinary. Ford Werke's profits surged during the war years. Even as cities burned and supply chains fractured, the Cologne plant maintained production, secured contracts, expanded capacity. The German government paid promptly. Military contracts were priority spending. The company accumulated Reichsmarks that couldn't be repatriated during wartime, but represented real value. Real claims on future economic activity. When the war ended, those claims would still exist, waiting to be converted back into dollars, reinvested into the post-war economy. Meanwhile, Ford's American operations experienced their own wartime boom. The company converted civilian production lines to military manufacturing, building jeeps, tanks, aircraft engines for the Allied forces. The Willow Run plant in Michigan became one of the largest factories in the world, producing B-24 bombers at a rate that seemed impossible, one aircraft every 63 minutes at peak production. The American government paid cost-plus contracts, guaranteeing profit margins on top of expenses. Ford received tax breaks, subsidies for factory expansion, priority access to materials. The war was the most lucrative period in the company's history up to that point. Both sides of the Atlantic, both sides of the conflict.
The Ford system was doing what it was built to do: produce at scale, deliver on contracts, generate returns. The human cost remained externalized. In Cologne, forced laborers worked until they collapsed. In Detroit, workers faced grueling conditions, but at least received wages, union protections, the possibility of quitting. The difference wasn't in the production system itself. Both factories used the same principles of assembly line efficiency, but in the legal and political context surrounding them. One operated in a democracy with labor laws. The other operated under a regime that treated human beings as disposable inputs. The Ford system adapted to both environments with equal efficiency. When Allied forces liberated Cologne in March 1945, they found the Ford work factories still standing, largely intact despite heavy bombing of the surrounding city. The plant had been a priority target for air raids, but its dispersed layout and robust construction had allowed it to survive. American military investigators arrived to assess what had happened, who had been responsible, what should be done with the facility. They found records of forced labor, contracts with the Wehrmacht, evidence of collaboration with Nazi economic planners. They also found something more complicated: a factory that had operated according to the legal requirements of its host country, that had fulfilled contracts under what could be argued was state compulsion, that had employed German managers who claimed they had no choice but to comply with regime demands. The investigators faced a dilemma. Prosecuting the German managers of Ford Werke would raise uncomfortable questions about the American parent company's relationship to its subsidiary.
It would require examining how much control Detroit actually maintained during the war, how profits were structured, whether American executives had knowingly benefited from forced labor. It would also set a precedent. If foreign subsidiaries could be held accountable for wartime actions, what did that mean for other American companies operating in Germany? General Motors, IBM, Standard Oil, all of whom had similar subsidiary relationships. The legal and political implications were enormous. The solution was pragmatic silence. Some German managers faced denazification proceedings, a bureaucratic process that resulted in fines, temporary bans from management positions, but rarely serious punishment. The forced laborers received nothing: no compensation, no apology, no formal acknowledgement of what had been done to them. Ford Werke was returned to Ford Motor Company's control. The factory resumed civilian production.
Within a few years, it was manufacturing cars again, supplying the European market, contributing to the post-war economic recovery. The system had survived. Back in America, Ford's wartime contributions were celebrated. The company received public recognition for its role in the arsenal of democracy, for the engineering marvel of Willow Run, for helping defeat fascism through industrial might. Henry Ford had died in 1947. His legacy complicated, but largely intact. The company moved forward, expanding into new markets, developing new models, competing in the booming post-war economy. The German subsidiary became just another division, its wartime history gradually fading from corporate memory. But the forced laborers didn't forget. Decades later, survivors began organizing, demanding recognition, seeking compensation for the years stolen from them.
They had worked building trucks for the Wehrmacht while receiving starvation rations. They had watched fellow prisoners die from exhaustion and abuse. They had been treated as machinery, as temporary inputs in a production process that valued efficiency over humanity. And when the war ended, they had been sent home with nothing, expected to simply resume their lives as if those years hadn't happened. It took more than 50 years for the pressure to become undeniable. In the late 1990s, class action lawsuits were filed in American courts by survivors of forced labor, targeting companies that had used their labor during the war. Ford was named alongside other major corporations. The legal arguments were complex: questions of jurisdiction, statutes of limitations, corporate liability across decades and borders.
But the moral argument was simple. People had been forced to work without pay, under brutal conditions, to produce profits that still benefited the companies that had exploited them. Ford initially resisted, arguing that the German subsidiary had been under Nazi control, that the American parent company bore no legal responsibility, that too much time had passed for claims to be valid. But the public pressure mounted. Documents emerged from archives showing more continuity between Detroit and Cologne than had been officially acknowledged. Historians demonstrated that American executives had maintained some contact with the German subsidiary even during the war, that profit reports had been filed, that post-war reintegration had been smooth and profitable. In 2000, Ford joined other German and American companies in establishing a compensation fund for former forced laborers. The fund was structured as a humanitarian gesture, not a legal admission of guilt. Each survivor received a one-time payment, approximately $2,500, for years of forced labor, for trauma that lasted lifetimes. The amount was calculated based on what was politically feasible, what companies were willing to pay to close the chapter, not on any meaningful assessment of what had been taken. The payment came with no apology from Ford specifically, no detailed accounting of what had happened at Ford Workey, no commitment to transparent historical reckoning. The company contributed its share to the fund and moved on. The legal cases were dismissed. The matter was considered settled. But settlement isn't the same as resolution.
The forced laborers who received those checks understood what the amount represented, the minimum necessary to make the problem go away. The payment acknowledged that something had happened without examining why it had been allowed to happen, how the system had functioned, what mechanisms had permitted a company celebrated for efficiency and innovation to profit from human suffering without consequence. Because that's the deeper question this history raises. Ford Workey didn't operate as a rogue subsidiary. It operated according to the principles that made Ford successful: maximize production, minimize costs, fulfill contracts, generate returns. The forced labor wasn't an aberration. It was a cost reduction strategy, a solution to a labor shortage, a way to maintain output when voluntary workers weren't available. The system didn't malfunction during the war. It adapted.
It found new inputs when old ones became scarce. It continued optimizing for efficiency, even when efficiency meant treating human beings as disposable resources. And when the war ended, the system didn't face dismantling. It faced rebranding. The same factories, the same production methods, the same corporate structures continued operating. The forced laborers were replaced with paid workers, but the assembly lines kept running. The trucks that had supplied the Wehrmacht were redesigned for civilian markets, but the manufacturing knowledge remained. The profits accumulated during the war were reinvested into post-war expansion, helping Ford compete in the global economy that emerged from the rebel. This is what makes the story disturbing in a way that simple villainy wouldn't be. If Ford Werk had been a criminal conspiracy, a deliberate plot to profit from atrocity, it would be easier to categorize.
Easier to dismiss as an exception. But it wasn't exceptional. It was the ordinary functioning of industrial capitalism under extraordinary circumstances. It was a system designed to maximize efficiency, encountering a context where efficiency meant exploitation, and the system simply proceeding. No dramatic moral crisis, no agonized decision-making, just contracts, production targets, quarterly reports. The forced laborers were line items in accounting ledgers. Their suffering was externalized, kept off the balance sheet, treated as someone else's problem, the regime's problem, the war's problem, history's problem. The profits, meanwhile, were internalized, recorded, reinvested, compounded over decades into the wealth that still defines the corporation today. And this is why the compensation fund, however necessary, couldn't actually resolve anything.
Because the question isn't just what happened at Ford Werk during the war. The question is what it means that a system built on these principles, maximize efficiency, externalize costs, pursue profit within whatever legal framework exists, can function across such radically different moral contexts without fundamental change. What does it mean that the same corporate structure can serve democracy and dictatorship with equal competence? That the same production methods can build prosperity and sustain atrocity? That the same financial mechanisms can generate wealth, regardless of whether that wealth is built on free labor or forced labor? These aren't rhetorical questions, they're structural ones. Because Ford still exists. The company has evolved, reformed, adapted to new regulations and social expectations. It operates in a world with labor laws, human rights standards,
Corporate social responsibility frameworks.
but the fundamental logic remains: maximize shareholder value, optimize production, compete for market share, grow. The system that allowed Ford-Werke to profit from forced labor wasn't dismantled after the war. It was regulated, constrained, made more accountable. But the core mechanism, the drive to extract maximum value from minimum input, that survived. The war ended, the profits did not. They were reinvested, compounded, transformed into the capital that funded post-war expansion, that built new factories, that developed new technologies, that created jobs and products and economic growth. The forced laborers who made those profits possible received $2,500 55 years late. The company that exploited them became one of the most disgusting corporations in the world. This is the machinery we don't talk about.
Not because it's hidden, but because it's everywhere. Because examining it too closely means questioning systems we depend on, structures we've built our economies around, assumptions we've accepted as natural. It means asking whether efficiency is always good, whether profit justifies means, whether corporations can be trusted to self-regulate when regulation conflicts with returns. It means confronting the possibility that the war didn't create these problems. It just revealed them, stripped away the peacetime niceties that usually obscure how the system actually functions. The forced laborers knew this. They spent decades trying to make people understand that what happened to them wasn't an aberration, but a logical extension of how industrial capitalism operates when unconstrained by democratic accountability. They weren't asking for charity. They were demanding recognition that the wealth built on their suffering still exists, still generates returns, still benefits people who never had to confront the cost. Most of them are gone now. The last survivors are in their 90s, their testimony fading into historical record. The companies have outlived them. The system has outlived them. And the question remains: what do we do with this knowledge? Do we treat it as history, something that happened in a specific time and place under unique circumstances, never to be repeated? Or do we recognize it as revelation, a glimpse of what the machinery can do when the constraints are removed, when efficiency becomes the only value that matters? Because the war didn't end the system, it tested it.
Proved it could function under the most extreme conditions, demonstrated that profit could be extracted from almost any circumstance if the legal and political framework permitted it. And then, when the war ended, the system simply continued, slightly reformed, slightly more careful, but fundamentally unchanged. The trucks Ford-Werke built are long gone, scrapped or rusted into history. The factory still stands, modernized and expanded, producing vehicles for the European market. The forced laborers are mostly dead. The executives who made the decisions are all dead. But the mechanism persists. The drive to optimize, to maximize, to extract value regardless of context. It persists because we've built our entire economic order around it. Because questioning it means questioning everything. The war ended. The machinery did not. It just found new markets, new inputs, new ways to generate returns. And somewhere in the ledgers, buried under decades of accounting, the profits from those wartime contracts are still there, compounded into the present, invisible but real. If you found this investigation valuable, subscribe to War Profits. Share this with someone who needs to understand how war became business. And in the comments, tell me, when does efficiency become exploitation? When does profit become complicity? The machinery is still running. The question is whether we're willing to look at how it works.